Hi guys! Surprise! I'm alive! I realized it's kind of rude for people like me to not keep up with their YouTube channel because people probably think I'm dead, but I'm not. If you ever are actually wondering if I am in fact alive, check out my blog. I have a link in the description to the video, and I'm usually a little bit better about keeping up to date on there, so you can have a little bit more idea if I am still around or not. But I will try to be better about keeping up with you guys here. You can probably tell that I'm back in the hospital. It's a bit of a saga as to how I ended up here. Started, I think, over a year ago at this point. I am one for weird transplant complications. This one, spoiler alert, not my usual lung infections. Took a twist to the weird this time, but you know, I like to keep it fresh and interesting. I wouldn't want to bore you with the same old medical drama every single time. So a little over a year ago, I suddenly developed these lumps at either end of my transplant incision. My doctor said that they were not a big deal, that I probably had sutures there. Sometimes they get, you know, kind of irritated and swollen around them, and that as long as they didn't get infected, it was fine. But he did tell me to keep an eye out for any signs of infection because infections apparently like to hang out around sutures and cause problems. So fast forward several months, and finally one of them, instead of doing the usual, which they had been doing for months, which is they would off and on get a little painful, get a little swollen, but like no big deal. This time it decided to get really painful and swollen and turned red. So that was a little alarming. So went to the doctor. By the time I ended up getting in to see my transplant surgeon, which is who my transplant team wanted me to go see, it had actually, the redness had faded and it had calmed down. But he did say that there was probably an infection in there and that we might need to, you know, open me up and clean it all out, and maybe if he can find it, take the suture out. But that we needed to wait for it to be flaring so he could see where the infection was. So that took another month. After a month, started acting up again. Came back in, he took a look, and we scheduled a surgery date. So that should have been the end of it, but of course that would be too easy, and I go for the drama. So instead what happened is that before I got to my surgery date, I started running a fever. And fevers, when you are immunosuppressed, are bad because any sign of like real infection immune response is a problem, because we're trying to keep my immune system nice and quiet so it doesn't notice my lungs and try and take them out. Also because anti-rejection meds suppress your immune system, and that actually makes it hard for you to mount any immune response. So having a fever at all is unusual and, you know, could be a sign of something, you know, pretty major going on, even if it's a low grade fever. So I ended up in the ER. Of course, as soon as I got to the ER, everything was fine and I no longer had a fever. So I was in the hospital for like a day and then ended up going home. But then things started acting up again, and again I had a fever, and this time it spiked pretty high. And I also noticed a third lump, and this one seemed to be in my breast. So that was kind of concerning that now I had even more lumps than I'd had to start with. So at that time they brought me in the hospital, and they were not going to send me home until they knew what was going on. Unfortunately for me, this was Christmas weekend, so the whole hospital was basically shut down for the weekend. But they didn't want to send me home because they were afraid if something went wrong that we would have trouble, you know, getting me back in. And I really didn't want to have to go through another ER trip, so I ended up just sitting and twiddling my thumbs for the whole weekend so that I would be ready to, you know, get testing and figure things out when the hospital opened back up after the holiday weekend. Long story short, what is growing in my body in now 3 lumps? Although one of them is really lump junior because it's like an offshoot of one of the original lumps. So I have lump, other lump, and lump junior. Anyways, what's in these lumps? Pseudomonas. freaking monas, my nemesis, my lifelong enemy, the infection that is constantly plaguing my life, has now taken a turn for the weird and has created abscesses in my chest cavity. The leading theory as to how I have Pseudomonas in my chest cavity growing abscesses is that it happened during transplant, because apparently when they're taking out the lungs, apparently CF lungs are difficult to get out. They kind of get stuck in there and they're very degraded, so it can be a little difficult to get them out. And during that process, it's possible for infections that are in the lungs to escape into the chest cavity. So the leading theory is that the Pseudomonas has just been hanging out and that it kind of gravitated towards those sutures and set up shop, and that for some reason it took this long for it to start causing problems. That's the weird part, because I'm immunosuppressed, so we would have expected it to start making problems pretty much immediately, or definitely within the first year. We would not have expected it to wait a couple years before suddenly starting to cause problems. So that kind of threw everybody for a loop a little bit, but my infectious disease doctor said she's seen it before, she's seen it take longer, and you know, she's pretty confident that that's where the Pseudomonas came from. So that happened. So they put me on some IV antibiotics, they sent me home. Again, that should have been the end of the story, but it's me, and it's never that easy. So after a couple weeks of IV antibiotics, and by the way, a very grueling IV antibiotic schedule, because I am resistant to almost everything at this point. There are very few options left. So the one we were doing is called Cifidricol, I think it's Cifidricol, something like that. And unfortunately for me, that antibiotic needs to be administered every 6 hours and needs to run for 3 hours. So if you do the math on that one, there's very little hours of consecutive sleep involved in that whole process. So after 2.5 weeks of really not sleeping and being an exhausted basket case, we got some more test results back, and surprise, my Pseudomonas is resistant to Cifidricol. So that was a wasted effort, and that was very, very disheartening to have put so much time and sleeplessness into a worthless antibiotic. So that's a problem, because the only antibiotics left that it is susceptible to are ototoxic, which means they can harm your hearing. And my hearing is already harmed. I already have permanent ringing in my ears from tobramycin, which is one of the antibiotics that we could use. And another antibiotic is called amikacin that can cause hearing loss, and I already have some hearing loss from my antibiotics. So we had really, really been trying to avoid those antibiotics, but we're kind of out of options at this point. So it took a while for everyone to come up with a plan. We were kind of waiting to see what the infection did, what the abscesses did. We were waiting actually also for an experimental treatment to come back called bacteriophages, which I'll talk about another time. And we were waiting for everyone to decide if they wanted to do surgery or if they didn't want to do surgery. I have a lot of different teams following me at this point. I've got the transplant team, I've got my transplant surgeon, I've got the infectious disease team, and everybody has their own opinions, and their opinions don't always match. So there was a lot of kind of fussing and discussing while everybody was figuring out what was going on. But we finally decided that yes, I am going to have surgery. Although the catch is, in the meantime, Lump and Lump Jr. are smaller and no longer require surgery because, possibly a little TMI grossness, Lump popped and drained. And since Lump and Lump Jr. are connected, it drained both of them, and then it didn't grow back. So that was nice, because the first time it popped, it did grow back. But the second time it popped, it didn't. So no surgery on Lump and Lump Jr. Other Lump, on the other hand, was all swollen and red and awful by the time I was seeing the doctor. So he was like, yes, definitely, surgery, drain it, etc. However, like a day after I saw the doctor, other lump decided it wasn't getting enough attention. So it also popped, and it was really large. So it popped really dramatically and incredibly grossly. It was basically my own private episode of Dr. Pimple Popper, and I think that show is appalling and disgusting, and I refuse to watch it. So really, it was not a fun process. But it did pop, and it drained, and it got a lot smaller, and it felt a lot better. But my doctor still wants me to have them go in and clean it all out, and also start me on IV amikacin, the antibiotic that I mentioned, which is ototoxic. But again, we don't really have much in the way of options at this point. So they wanted me to come into the hospital today, get a couple doses of IV amikacin into my body and get things started. And then tomorrow I'm having surgery to de-lumpify me. It's not a major surgery. The lump is pretty superficial, so they really just need to like open it and clean it. It's not a big deal, but it's still surgery, and I'm sure it's not going to be comfortable. And also I'm in the hospital, and that's never fun. I'm going to be here probably at least a few days because they need to stabilize the dosage and, you know, get things settled before they send me home for IV home infusion. So that's my latest twist in my transplant journey. Weird Pseudomonas abscesses in my chest. So add that to the list of things that can happen to you when you have a lung transplant. All right, there's definitely more to continue about this story, but this is getting a little long, so we're gonna cut it here and stay tuned for the latest adventures in my medical journey. See you next time.